Neith-hotep is the earliest female empress in Africa that's ever been recorded. Now, she's not the first queen to be recorded, but the first empress. Her name comes from the goddess Neith, who, amongst other things, was a god of war. She is later seen as the god of the noon and the god of Ra and Pepi or Apep. So you can see there that she plays a very diverse role, the goddess, not the real person, in her divinity, in her deity state. This Neith, who gave the name to Neith-hotep, is very important, especially in the early years of ancient Egypt. But if we move on from Neith-hotep, from Neith, and move to Neith-hotep, what we find is something very interesting. Like I said, she's an empress in her own right, at least at some point. It's not fully understood when. Was it prior to or after Narmer? But one of those, she was legitimately in charge. Now, something that we do know is that she married Narmer, thus making it official that Narmer would rule both the North and the South. But if this is true, that means that the power lay in her hands. Good thing is, she, after Narmer's death, ruled at least for a while. Now, I could sit here and tell you the story about how they mistook her for a king at one point, but that's not the true story of Egypt. That's the story of Egyptologists, and we're not going to do that. Let's talk about the true story of Egypt. So, this woman and man, obviously, at some point, must have come together to form this kingdom. Now, it's interesting that we see here Neith wearing the red crown, the deshret, on her head, because from this point on, these two crowns would be combined to form what we know today as ancient Egypt. So, but knowing that the power lay in the hands of this female, and knowing the culture of the Nubians and the culture of the people who lay just south of Lower Egypt, we realize that it is possible that even though Narmer was destroying the men, that the power really lay within the woman. And instead of killing woman and taking her power, he married her, thus saving lives, combining two great empires or two great cultures, and making a way bigger culture. Now, Narmer would go on to take parts of Asia, take parts of Nubia, and form Egypt. Now, of course, there are some Egyptologists who have other theories, some suggesting that um, Egypt and other parts of Egypt started before Narmer and this queen got together, and that they were just continuing something great. Now, this is how you write Neith-hotep. At least this is one way of writing. The other one is to write a water wave with that semicircle, and there you go, you got neat. This is interesting for a couple of reasons, not the writing part, but the fact that there is some disagreement. It's interesting because, firstly, for there to even be a solution to that problem in the form of writing, going back this far back, let me just say the date because I haven't said it yet. We're talking about 3150 BC. That's 5,000 years ago. We're talking about a long time ago. We have more evidence for these people than we do for Jesus Christ of Nazareth. Now, some people have this thought in their head like, oh, we couldn't have evidence for Jesus so old. We have actual evidence of these people, and they're old as hell. We even find some artifacts and some carvings and some drawings in certain rocks and areas in Egypt that show us that certain kings were still taking over those lands. So, yes, we find giant, large things that show us of the proof of these people and how they lived. So, like I said, at some point she was queen regent, and basically she was an empress for a while who ruled Egypt until her son took over, Hor-Aha. Now, I want to first state something, which is that the people in Asia would have been called, at least later, would have been called Aimu or Haimu, meaning Asiatics. Now, what the Egyptians called each other is very interesting, but let's not get into that right now. Let's talk about the fact that in Egypt, in Egypt, we find right at the very beginning of their history female powers, female rule. Sure, a lot of that would decay as things would go along, but we see the same type of historical thread that we've always been seeing within African kingdoms: female rule. And instead of it being, when we look at other people in later years, we look at the fact that they struggled because they were female. This is the very beginning, and we're seeing already powerful women. Now, you're probably thinking the word neath sounds very modern for something that happened back then. Well, like I showed you, the symbol for N is that zigzag, and the other letter is a T. So her name is NT, which has been made simpler by saying neath. But it could be nut, it could be net, it could be Nuthotep, or Nethotep, probably closer, or Nethotep. Who knows about the true pronunciations that these people had? Remember, even in English, if we look today, it's very difficult for us, if we were just writing, to get exactly what the meaning of words are. I mean, if you look at the word moon, it's very possible that even if someone spoke a version of English, that they would pronounce that word very wrong because of how strange it looks compared to many other words. I mean, for lecturers could be going around saying ma'on, thinking that it's correct, but you look at moon, it's just moon. Eventually, Hor-Aha would take over and start building giant buildings like temples and stuff like that in order to continue the reality that the Egyptians were going through. And they did this and became very successful as a people, so much so that we still look at them today as this crazy group. But one thing we should not do is forget the females that were responsible, especially if they're as powerful and well known back then and seen as a real entrance into the kingdoms of ancient Egypt. And remember, the ancient Egyptians are lucky because this woman would have been considered ancient in ancient Egypt. What do I mean by that? Well, let's take, 1500 BC. What's the difference between 1500 BC and 3100 BC? You know, it's a long time. So they have confirmation about who was there in the beginning in the form of writing, tombs, and all the stuff. Whereas, you know, all kinds of parts on Earth have some missing gaps that cannot be filled in, but the Egyptians kept their stuff real good. Now, to think that this is how Egypt actually started, its real start, forget the wars, forget all of that stuff. It started with the unification of a female and a male, and eventually would get to where it is. She might have been named after the goddess Neith, a mythological figure, but I think that she raised herself to a god status herself.